Hello, anatomy friends. This is Dr. Alsop, and in this video, we will be discussing the very basics of external brain structures. In essence, we're really going to begin to discuss the terms that we need to know before we get into the more complex concepts discussed in upcoming clinical lectures. So this will be very big picture. We will be identifying and some basic descriptions of those major features of the brain. Now, I hope you recall that the brain is a component of the central nervous system along with the spinal cord. It is found in the cranium, and the cerebrum is what most people think of when they think of the brain. It's the largest portion, it's the most easy to see in terms of the external view. But there will be deeper structures such as the diencephalon, and then you'll have the more inferior structures, the brainstem and the cerebellum. But we're going to start with this biggest portion, the cerebrum. Often people incorrectly assume the brain is just the cerebrum because it's the largest and most visible portion of the brain. It's going to be composed of the right and the left hemispheres, cerebral hemispheres. And then in terms of the deep structures, you're going to have what's referred to as basal ganglia. These are going to be composed of subcortical nuclei. And you can see some of these in the image here on the bottom right. It's going to be these kind of bluer structures here. So recall that nuclei are composed of cell bodies of neurons. So when you're doing a superficial survey, you're not going to be able to see these ganglia, but if you go deeper, you'll see them there. So we're going to focus in on some of the more superficial features that are going to be easily observable. And so probably the most characteristic component of the cerebrum are these folds or ridges that you'll see throughout the entirety of the cerebrum. And these are called the gyri or gyrus when you're talking singular. And these are going to be composed primarily of gray matter. The gyri will function to increase the surface area of the brain, which is important for our complex cognitive functions as the brain is pretty stringently constrained by the surrounding bone. With the size of the brain, it can only be so large because it has to fit within the cranium. So these gyri will allow for this greater surface area. The sulci or sulcus, when you're talking singular, are the depressions or the grooves of the gyri. And then you're going to have fissures, which are going to be the more prominent separations or clefts to separate certain components of the cerebrum. So the most prominent fissure is going to be the longitudinal cerebral fissure. So if you're just looking at half the brain here, it's going to split the right and the left cerebral hemispheres running down the sagittal plane. So it in essence will split the cerebrum into two equal halves. The dural partition, the falx cerebri, is going to be located there as well. The central sulcus separates the frontal from the parietal lobes. And since it's a sulcus, it's not as prominent as a fissure. Actually, sometimes it is a little difficult to tell if you're looking at the central sulcus on an actual brain. But it's important for differentiating two important gyri, your precentral gyrus as well as the postcentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex, whereas the postcentral gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex. Each cerebral hemisphere is separated conceptually into various lobes. Specifically, you'll have the frontal, talk a lot about that one, the parietal, temporal and occipital lobes are going to be the most grossly visible. They are named for the surrounding bones, but it's important to note that the lobes do not match up exactly in terms of size as that overlying bone, but they're in close proximity. Now, in this illustration on the right, we are looking at a sagittal section of the brain, and we're looking medially. So we often refer to this as a hemisected brain. So think you begin by dividing the cerebral hemispheres at the longitudinal cerebral fissure, and you just continue to separate the other components of the brain. And so in this view, you can see some of those deeper structures that we talked about. You can see the larger cerebral cortex, that gray matter there, but we can also see the corpus callosum, which is this kind of whiter structure right here. It's also part of the cerebrum. It's important in terms of communication between the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. But we need to move on from the cerebrum at some point. So let's talk a little bit about the diencephalon. This is one that you really can't see very well unless you have sectioned the brain. It's often described as the central core of the brain. There will be lots of different parts. You'll have the dorsal thalamus, you'll have the hypothalamus, you'll also have the epithalamus, which is kind of the posterior aspect of the diencephalon. The hypophysis, or the pituitary gland, is often what you hear it referred to. Hypophysis or the hypophysis, you'll hear either way. It's going to be really well protected by bony elements. You'll have the hypophyseal fossa of the sphenoid bone where that pituitary will sit within. And it's going to be connected via the infundibulum, which is considered a part of the diencephalon, specifically the hypothalamus, based on development. So that's going to be a really important connection there. We know the function of this endocrine gland is hugely important for many metabolic processes, in particular growth. Again, the functions of all of these structures of the diencephalon are super cool, and they will be discussed in other areas of the curriculum. Our major focus here is just kind of understanding the general location. All right, moving on to the brainstem, which is composed of the more proximal midbrain, the intermediate pons, and then the distal medulla oblongata, which is the medulla is going to be the part that's continuous with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum of the occipital bone. So once you get to about where the foramen magnum is, the name would change to spinal cord distal to that. The brainstem has many functions which will be discussed in upcoming lectures, and it's also where almost all the cranial nerves are going to originate. Last but not least is the cerebellum. I often conceptualize the cerebellum as kind of a mini cerebrum, although these structures have some big differences in terms of function. But the cerebellum also has two hemispheres, so two cerebellar hemispheres, similar to the cerebral hemispheres. Now, the cerebellar hemispheres are connected by a small structure called the vermis. Just of note, the relative similarity in names between the cerebrum and the cerebellum is often a source of consternation for many students, and maybe even this faculty member that you're listening to right now. So make sure you pay special attention to say a name or of an artery. You're paying attention to whether you're talking about a cerebral artery or a cerebellar artery. There are going to be differences there, so just be mindful of your names. All right, excellent. Hope you are feeling familiar with the names and the general location of the major components of the brain. Please reach out if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your day.